Jennifer Down is a writer and editor. Her debut novel, Our Magic Hour, was shortlisted for the 2014 Victorian Premier Literary Award for an unpublished manuscript. The story collection Pulse Points won the 2018 Reading Prize and the 2018 Steel Rood Award in Queensland. She was named a Sydney Morning Herald novelist in the year 2017 and 2018. Bodies of Light, her second novel, won the 2022 Miles Franklin Award, Literary Award, and she lives in Naarm in Melbourne. I just met somebody 2 days ago who knows Helen Garner, who's a previous Miles Franklin Award winner, and I'll introduce you to him. Next time, maybe, I think she's quite old now, right? Yeah, okay. All right, and in conversation with Jennifer, we have Shreya Senhandli. Shreya is the author of Handle with Care, a short story collection, Strange and Memoirs of My Body, best nonfiction book at the NWS Writing, that's NWS is what? Nottingham, okay. Writing Awards 2018, and UNESCO Cities of Literature Best Reads in 2017. She is the first South Asian woman to write an international opera, co-written for the Welsh National Opera film series Creating Change 2020 and Migrations 2022. Her play Quiet premiered at London's Tara Theatre. A former television journalist for CNBC, MTV, and East India head for Channel V, Shreya continues to write columns for the international media. Welcome on board, both of you.
I thought I'd be doing the introductions, but Anu's done them so brilliantly and well. I won't go over that ground again. But Auroville Literature Festival and I am very, very proud to be introducing this brilliant young Australian author to you. I've been reading her book, Bodies of Light, and I'm blown away by a number of things which we will go into. But most of all, I want this to be really fluid, freewheeling. I want it to ramble. I want you to have lots of time to ask her questions. So I've not got millions of questions, but I think the answers we will get will lead to many other questions. So, Jennifer Down. I wanted to ask you about, see, I scroll things on books, so I've got it scrolled all over the festival brochure itself. It's such an interesting book because reading it, I felt that it straddled different worlds. It's a story of, well, actually, why don't you tell us what the story is? And then I'll ask you what I felt about it and the stylistic points that really struck me. So tell us what your book, Bodies of Light, which is won the Miles Franklin Literary Award, the highest literary award in Australia for novels.
Yes.
Yeah? Tell us about this brilliant book.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for coming this morning. So Bodies of Light is, it spans a really long time. It begins in the 1970s and travels through to the present day. And it tells the story of a woman who grows up in what we in Australia call residential and out-of-home care. So this really confuses Americans because they are only familiar with foster care. I'm not sure of the different. I know in the UK they have children's homes, for instance, and things change a lot over time. But effectively, she's a ward of the state from the age of 5, and so she does experience foster homes, but she also experiences different modes of care. And I don't know, I say care with, swoosh, swoosh, quotation marks, inverted commas every time in this session, because in Australia, as in many countries, we do not take good care of our most vulnerable people, whether that's the elderly or people with disabilities or at-risk young people. And this character, Maggie, is subject to many and varied abuses, which is unfortunately not a problem that is confined to history. It's very much an ongoing systemic problem that we have. And so this story, this novel rather, tells the story of her childhood. It begins with her earliest memories and then travels through to the present day, where she's living under a different name and identity in Burlington, Vermont, in the northeast USA. And I guess it just tracks her life, and it's kind of a forensic account, I would say. It's, I used to pride myself on being, I was just listening to Karen talking about sort of the economy of good writing. And I used to sort of pride myself on that. My second book was a short story collection, and I really loved that form the most. And then I handed my editor this like 400-page brick, and I thought she would cut heaps of it out, but it's still really long. But I think that in part is because it kind of sticks with this character for such a long time, and through so many different periods of her life, and through so many different living circumstances, geographic, but also cohabitants and life events and things like that.
Yeah. Well, this character, Maggie, she's so authentic. Her voice rings so true. It could almost be memoir. I did find that you straddled two worlds almost, one of memoir and one of fiction. And you did it so well. It feels so well. Yet it's not memoir remotely, is it? It's got nothing to do with your own life. How did you come about this story? What made you want to write it?
Thank you, firstly. I'd never thought of this as reading like memoir, and then a few reviews and a few sort of interviewers and things mentioned it to me, and it always feels like one of the highest compliments that this particular book could be given. It's written in the first person, which might seem like an obvious, a really obvious answer, but that it was a really important choice stylistically because, as you said, Shreya, this is not my story. I have never, I'm not a care experienced person, as we say, and it was really important to me that this book didn't feel exploitative or as though I was kind of sensationalizing the very real abuse that many people have suffered and continue to suffer at the hands of the state. I wanted to sort of tell this story and honor it without, making it seem titillating. And there's this phrase, trauma porn, which I'm not a fan of, but I really wanted to resist anything that could be interpreted as trauma porn. Ultimately, I can't be the judge of whether I've done that, but in part of my attempt to do so was in creating this character who spoke in the first person. And forgive me, I think what I didn't say before was that the book starts in the present day and sort of flips back chronologically. It travels through Maggie's life, and we get it's interspersed with little moments of return to the present day, where she's speaking as sort of a middle-aged adult in her 50s. And I think I wanted it to feel like an account that she was sharing with the reader. I wanted it to feel quite intimate, but it's also an account that she is providing to herself. And there's a passage in this book that for me is sort of, it's almost the hinge of the entire novel, even though it's not necessarily the most climactic or exciting moment. But there's a moment where Maggie, I think she's 19 at the time, she requests her state care records from the government. And this is basically anything that the government has on file about you as your sort of legal guardian. And by the time she's 18, she's discharged from the care of the state officially. And there's a lot of blind spots in her memory partly because of how trauma affects our memory, and partly because of the sort of profound dislocation of her childhood. She's moved around and shuttled from place to place, almost constantly. And so she's trying to sort of fill in these gaps in memory and to reconcile conflicting memories. And she requests her records. And this is unfortunately a really, really common experience, even now, that's had by care leavers and care survivors. Often, particularly, I like to think that social workers are getting better, but particularly back in the time that this book, that this character was experiencing care, social workers were not writing notes. Doctors, teachers, all of these professionals, who sort of engaged with these children they were not writing case notes thinking that they would ever be read by the child. And so they would often use language that, is now, for one thing, very outdated or offensive, but also is, at best impersonal and at worst kind of devastating to read. And that's if there is any that's if there are any notes at all. Often things get lost or they haven't been kept in the first place. And so I started really thinking about what it must be like to not have, these kind of tangible artifacts of self, whether it's your birth certificate, your immunization records, family photographs, and even intangible things like, I have 2 sisters and we're very close, and I can constantly say to them, do you remember when this happened? Or, we have this shared vocabulary of memory, and that simply cannot exist for a child who has grown up in this system.
Talked about family there, and it's family that actually brought you the story in a way, isn't it? But tell us a bit about that, and also the fact that you also talked about the fact that there aren't enough notes on these people who pass through the system. But I understand you did quite a bit of research as well. So how did you combine the two? The family inspiration part of it, and as well as the notes that you delved into, the journalistic and the familial, and how did that come together for you?
So when Shreya's talking about the family link, what you're talking about, I believe, is I think my kind of cognizance or awareness of this issue came from my parents, who are both welfare workers. My mother worked in child protection for many, many years, and then worked in a more sort of forensic capacity, basically. And this is cool. I never get to say this in Australia because I sort of have to protect her anonymity a little bit, But she worked actually interviewing people who had been in residential care and effectively she wrote a report that was tabled in Parliament. And these kinds of reports, they don't really ever achieve anything, but it's so the government can pat themselves on the back and say, we've made we'll read these recommendations. They don't ever actually take them in. But she worked with a colleague on a report like that. And my dad he's actually a school teacher, but he, rather than teaching a class, his job for the last, he's retired now, but 40 years, was as a welfare coordinator, which, again, the title sometimes gets lost in translation across countries and cultures, but it's sort of like a school counsellor, but he doesn't have a psychology qualification. And so a lot of his job was very practical. It would be, he worked at a school that was just year 11 and 12 students, so matric. And it was a school where there were a lot of children or students experiencing homelessness, substance abuse issues, problems at home. And so he counselled students, unofficially, but most of his job was quite practical. It was making sure that students had, secondhand copies of the textbooks if they needed them, that they were turning up to school if they wanted to, that they could be driven to medical appointments or had access to, reproductive care. And so growing up, that was very much a part of the kind of fabric of our conversations as a family. And I was always very conscious from, a super young age that not everybody had sort of I wouldn't necessarily, my childhood was not always stable. My mum was unwell for a lot of it, and there was a lot of movement, but I never doubted that I was loved. I was always very secure, even when we didn't have a lot of money or, I was staying with my grandparents. I always knew, that I had this kind of secure base. And equally, I was aware from a young age that does not exist for everybody or, for many people indeed.
And you did some research as well, didn't you?
Yes. So the stuff that mum and dad would talk about when I was growing up, it was anecdotal, but it was also their clients and their students. So they weren't kind of going into detail or naming names, obviously. And I remember reading, I guess because I've always been interested in this issue, I would kind of devour anything I could find on it, but it's so underreported in Australian media. And so a lot of the information that I would read as, I don't want to say out of interest, but there's more a compulsion to bear witness to this, I suppose. A lot of it came from things like parliamentary inquiries, and there was a report that was published in 2004 called the Forgotten Australians Report, and I was 14 when that came out, and I remember reading it when it became available online, and it was an account of out-of-home care. This is not the one that my mum worked on, but an account of out-of-home care, and it involved a lot of first-person testimony from care leavers and care survivors throughout the 20th century. And I remember reading it and just being kind of, I don't know, I always say that like nothing in my research really surprised me because of some of the stories I'd heard. But it was deeply, deeply saddening to learn how little had changed. Effectively, the kind of systems or the models of care had changed over time. But the reality is that, children were being subjected to horrific abuse in the 1930s, and it's no different now. In fact, the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care is increasing, which is, again, I don't know if I can be surprised given, the racism of a country like Australia, but it just feels, I don't know, I can feel myself getting angry when I even just talking about it in this context.
I know the feeling. Yeah, but don't be fooled into thinking just because I'm talking about your research, which did impress me, that it isn't a beautifully written book. Would you like to, at this point, read us a short extract from it? Thank you.
So I should not read something very depressing. Maybe I'll read this section that you suggested. This is a section of relative stability in Maggie's adolescence. It's her first relationship, and she's, I can't know how old she is. I think she's about 13. She's living in a foster family, and it's not perfect, but it's one of the better placements that she's had, and she is kind of tentatively navigating this relationship as a young person who doesn't have a lot of guidance necessarily, but also as a teenager who is a sex abuse survivor, a child sex abuse survivor. I mentioned that this is not a graphic or hopefully triggering passage, but I just wanted to note, that's the context. Sex felt like nothing to me, but we kept doing it. Down by the creek, someone dumped an old double mattress, an island of quilted baby blue. We brushed the gum leaves and dirt from it, laid down a tarp for the damp. At sundown, the crickets sang. The brush gave out twitches and rustles. It felt wild there. It felt far from our lives. I liked kissing him. He had the most beautiful mouth. When the nights got colder, we went exploring. Berwick was being mapped into sprawling streets that curved like the ones in American films. The bones of houses had started to appear, tidy rectangles of brick and timber. Countless half-built, off-the-plan structures that smelled of sawdust and soil. Houses with ensuite bathrooms, with 2-car garages, with designs for a patio out back. Dinesh and I ran up half-finished staircases that led to nowhere, like an Escher print come to life. We stepped carefully across beams, traced our initials in freshly poured concrete, jumped from behind particle board walls to scare each other. We guessed at what purpose each room was to serve and what sort of people would live there. We fucked in those houses too. It was exciting to be there with him, the thrill of the trespass, our names tattooed in the foundations of a stranger's bedroom, but also eerie. Sometimes in those brand new houses, I was filled with a dread I couldn't name. So many rooms, or almost rooms, blank and awful. Pipes jutting like organs from a cadaver mid-autopsy, places where unfinished floors dropped away to grim pits of earth beneath. Walls disgorging insulation. They were houses too young for ghosts, And yet in those timber skeletons, I felt something unsettled in the air. Still we curled, warm-blooded, between picnic rug and polar fleece blanket.
No. Hello. Right, okay. We'll just pass it back and forth then. Okay, so I'm struck by, obviously, Australia is a very multicultural country, and your book is full of people from, very different walks of life, ethnicities. So there's a little Vietnamese girl that Maggie bonds with and tries to help out. Dinesh is Sri Lankan. I am struck by your empathy in terms of how you're able to describe all these people, and it doesn't feel like an alien hand is at it, if you know what I mean. I was very interested when I went to your website and found a little note right at the beginning, right at the top, I think, about the people who actually owned the land in the past. I have come across it on various smaller publishers' websites and so on in Australia. I wanted to ask you whether you felt, although this is for someone else to say, I suppose, rather than you, but we have to ask you, are you very much the norm for modern Australians, this new generation, in terms of the empathy, or are you an outlier?
Thank you. I think so. What you're talking about is what we would call an acknowledgement of country, which is something that would typically take place. At an event like this, for instance, the preference, culturally speaking, would be to have an Aboriginal person deliver a welcome to country. But if somebody's not available, then the next best option is that the first speaker or the MC or whoever it is would deliver an acknowledgement of country, and that would be done irrespective of whether you're a white person or a settler, a migrant settler, for instance. And there are different views on it in Australia. I think at worst it can seem tokenistic. I've certainly sat through a lot of corporate ones where I've seen, a government official, or even in the workplace context, where somebody, is reading off a sheet of paper and kind of butchering all of these names, and clearly, it's an exercise or a checkbox, a tokenistic exercise. And again, it's not for me to say as a white person whether or not it should be done at X event or Y event. The decision to put it on my website, I think, is not uncommon, to your point, among the younger generation. I think it is. I think it is important on one hand, what is a 2 sentences on my website, which probably no one visits, actually achieving nothing, right? But the way I see it is that it is it's a little pause mark, or you read that before you get to anything else on a website, and so it's just a way of saying, like, I'm a guest here, and of making sure that I'm thanking the original and continuing custodians of the land for sort of their hospitality and wisdom. And I think that's especially important for writers and artists in Australia, precisely because of the rich tradition, in all manners of culture, but especially oral storytelling and oral histories of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Lest I sound too hopeful, as I said, Australia, it's still a deeply racist country, and we're currently having a referendum on the voice to Parliament, which I won't go into. I'm not. You will find internet articles that can explain it much more eloquently, and probably less, angrily than I can. But it's effectively a very small. It represents a very small step towards. It's not like suddenly enshrining, equality or undoing years of racism or wiping things out. It's a very small, very modest step towards improved towards equality, which is still a very distant prospect. And what I'm hearing from the media at the moment, this isn't just my pessimism, but what I'm hearing from the media is that the no vote is likely to win. That is that there will be no treaty, and that the voice to Parliament for Aboriginal Australians will not be recognised. So, you know, I live in a bubble, I guess.
A few years further down the line, then maybe. Well, we're talking about equality, we're talking about balance. This session is called Balancing the Light. And I wanted to ask you about the balance you've struck in your book. I did sort of mention it before about how, you know, you've kind of got elements of memoir and you've got some research, but most of all, it's just brilliant fiction. In the Guardian review, which I looked up, the style of your writing, which I found very interesting because it's easy, it's fluid, and yet, well, let me try to explain it this way. I'm wearing Australian spiders on my ears today because they're powerful. But I've heard that when they creep up on you and bite you, you're not even aware it's happening. But when you're hit hard, you could die. So there's an element of that in your book where, you know, it's you're just going along with it so easily. It's fluid, it's free-flowing. It's not hard work in any way, but it is harrowing in many respects. It's a harrowing tale. It's hard-hitting. So how did you, and like I said, the Guardian review calls it disquieting, disconcerting mapping. And it's the mapping that I wanted to explore as well, the ethical precision, he calls it. So how did you, how did you approach it? What's your style of work in terms of, you know, your everyday process to get that beautiful balance?
Thank you. I guess like part of the balance is in a book like this where, you know, we keep talking about how heavy and dark it is. Part of the balance is making sure that there are moments of light. No pun intended, but and that's, you know, you could be really sort of mercenary or callous and say that from a technical or structural perspective, it has to be that way. Otherwise, no one would read 400 pages of unending bleakness. You know, I don't know. Maybe somebody here really loves A Little Life, and you know, whatever. But I think it's also not, my investment as a writer is towards verisimilitude, and like I love the sort of 19th century realist novelists. Like Emile Zola is one of my favorite authors, and that kind of meticulous devotion to representing things as they were or as they are is important to me. And so part of that means that, you know, no one's life, no one's life, no matter how difficult, is sort of devoid of moments of joy or beauty. And I wanted to reflect those as well. And then in terms of, I don't know, everyday practice, I don't have a very good balance. I am most Australian writers are working writers, and I was at the poetry session last night. It seems like it's that way here as well. It's very, you know, and in South Africa, indeed, sorry, having just heard Karen talk. I work a full-time job, and so I write whenever I can. When I was younger, I used to get up before work really early. I was really good about setting my alarm at sort of 4 o'clock, and I would get up and work right then before the workday started. And the last couple of years have been kind of challenging for a number of reasons. I mean, there was, of course, the pandemic and lockdowns, and then I was dealing with some sort of challenging. I was caring for a loved one who was terminally ill, and that just sort of meant that I was sleeping where I could, and it really, I stopped. I stopped. For about a year, I felt really bad that I could no longer get up when my alarm went off, and now I just write whenever I can. And often that's, you know, the thing I'm working on at the moment, it has mostly been written in my notes app, whether it's at a hospital bedside or at an airport, or I'm a lot less precious about, you know, I think when I was younger, I couldn't write in public, and I had to, you know, be at my desk, and as I get older and time is sort of more compressed, I mean, literally in my day-to-day, I just write in any slivers of time that I can, which is not like a romantic, I feel like that's always really disappointing teaching when I say that, but I do say it to students as much as I can. I sometimes teach, but I don't have like a PhD or anything, but I sometimes teach students, and I'm always at pains to tell them, like, you're just going to do it whenever you can. There's no there's no garret or coffee shop writing. I mean, maybe if you're really rich, I guess, or Americans seem to manage that really well. They, I think if you have an MFA and you get a big advance, you can maybe do a bit more of that.
Most of us are just trying to write whenever we can. Going back to the balancing, you did mention it, that, it would just be endlessly bleak if you didn't have that balance of light and dark, bit Dickensian as well. But there is wit in your story. There is this sort of the repartee between Judith and Maggie. And there's a snappiness to it, which has a nice rhythm. So I wondered if I didn't know if that was your second choice in terms of your reading, but if you wanted to read us a section of, yeah? Great, thank you.
So Judith is probably Maggie's best placement in terms of stability and in terms of the care that she's given, the sort of attention to her as a person. And sorry, I can't do two things at once.
Sorry, go ahead and read whichever.
No, sorry. Okay, sorry. I think I've got a section. So Judith is she is one. Yeah, as I said, one of Maggie's foster carers. She is an aged care nurse. She does not suffer fools gladly. Maggie, at the time that she comes to stay with Judith, is not attending school, and Judith will not stand for that. And in fact, she's kind of the reason that Maggie doesn't complete tertiary education, but she pursues it for a brief moment. And Judith is sort of the only reason that she's able to do that. It's literally the first time in her life that somebody has invested that much attention in her. After Youthicom, I was moved to a new foster home. The welfare had said it was unlikely given my age. I was just happy not to be back in resi. Sorry, resi as in residential care. Judith was a trim woman in her late 50s who wore thick eyeliner. She'd fostered a few kids over the years, but while I lived with her, it was just the two of us, though occasionally she took in emergency care placements. She had a glass aquarium with tropical fish that bobbed dumbly, and it always relaxed the little kids to look at the tank. Other things I remember from Judith's unit: wallpaper with native flowers in the bathroom, a month-to-month calendar hanging on the kitchen wall, each page with a different Gary Larson cartoon, a small mountain of lipstick-stained cigarette butts in the crystal ashtray by the back doorstep where she sat to smoke, a crawl space in the ceiling where she kept the portable cot and playpen, spare blankets and clothes, things like that. She worked in aged care, and she often left early in the mornings, long before I had to be at school, but there was no pulling the wool over her eyes. After a week or so of me pretending I'd been to school, stumping through the door at 4 o'clock with my backpack, she cornered me. "Listen, madam," she said, "I don't have many rules, but one of them is that as long as you're living here, you go to school." I decided to make peace with my stability. She was sometimes surprised at the things I didn't know how to do: light the stove, tape a show on the VCR, change a light globe. But she never made me feel bad. She just showed me how. She was sparing with her compliments and kept a closer eye on me than any carer I'd had before. She didn't mind what I did on the weekends or how late I got home. But in those early days, she made me sit with her to do my homework after dinner. She could outlast me in any battle. Like this. I sat at the kitchen table, geography textbook open in front of me, Sale of the Century blaring from the TV. Judith was reading the newspaper on the couch, still in her uniform, although she'd replaced her gummy nurse shoes with sheepskin slippers. I kept getting distracted by the buzzer noises, the bright voices, the flickering screen. Every time she caught me staring at the screen, she'd jab a finger at the pages spread before me and widen her eyes meaningfully. "You're a real hard ass," I said. "You've turned me into one," she said without looking up from her paper. "Bullshit," I breathed. I saw her lips twitch, the smallest of smiles. I decided to push it. What's the point in me sitting here copying out these stupid questions? I don't need to know about coastal erosion. I'm never going to use this. And I can leave school now anyway. You can, but you'd be a bloody idiot. I'm 15. You know what your problem is? She folded her paper and set it down. You're 15 years old and we're still having this bloody conversation. Just shut up and do it. I can't concentrate with this crap on, I said. Judah seized the remote control, aimed it at the screen and switched the TV off without lifting her eyes from mine. She raised an eyebrow. That better?
Thank you. I loved Judith. And my son, wrap up. Okay. Right. In that case, I will just ask you one last question. And that's really about the long list of achievements you already have. I mean, it's really brilliant. What is the secret of your success? Please tell us all. And then if there's time, we can maybe have a few questions from the audience. So yes, please.
Thank you. I don't know. I think my publisher just made my CV sound good. I don't know that, I think, look, no one was more surprised than I was when this book won the Miles Franklin Literary Award. Truly, I was when they called to tell me that I'd won, I sank to my knees like a woman in a sort of old-timey film. And I didn't know that people actually did that. And I like to think of myself as being relatively even-keeled. And, I always get told that I'm sort of able to handle things with relative equanimity. And I really swooned, like I lost control. And so, I don't know, it's not that there's not hard work involved, but it's also a lot of luck and timing. And I think that's true of all prizes. I don't think that's an Australian thing or a me thing. It's due to things that, I'm judging the Prime Minister's Literary Award at the moment. I'm embarrassed. If anybody sees my suitcase, it's not that I travel heavy. I've got like 2 pairs of socks. It's that it's full of books that I have to read 133 books in 5.5 weeks, and I'm dying. But, I can't help thinking that some of that, the decisions that I'm making when I'm sort of reading these books critically, a lot of it's based on timing. And, if I've read something, this might be a really good book, but I read this other book recently that was similar or I've read a lot about XYZ recently, or I'm willing to overlook sort of, maybe technical craft that's lacking or whatever, because this story is so fresh and exciting to me. So I don't know, I wish there was a secret to success, because then I could do it again and I could tell other people, I could tell students how to do it. But yeah, it's a lot of it is, like I said, it's not that it's not hard work, but it's chance and luck and timing. I think timing is a big part of publishing.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. It's been brilliant talking to you, but I think the audience might have some questions. So would you like to come up to whichever? Yeah, there are 2 mics there.
Hi.
Hi, Jennifer. Writing about trauma can be traumatic. So was it difficult for you? And what was your experience with working with editors on this piece? And also, if I could ask about the setting, you mentioned about Burlington, Vermont. Why Burlington? And I mean, I've heard it's a beautiful place. My uncle lives there. So was that the inspiration? Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Sorry, the first part of the question, not setting, was about trauma. Sorry, I'm tired and silly at the moment. I got in yesterday after the visa debacle, and it's been a joy, but I think my brain is not at its sharpest right now. Yeah, look, what I always say is that I started this research. It took me a long time to write and research. And when I first started, I think I had a really black and white understanding of trauma. So I'd heard of this idea of vicarious trauma, which is, self-explanatory, I think. But I conceived of it only as applying to people like social workers or nurses and doctors or, journalists in crisis zones or whatever. And I remember seeing my long-suffering and wonderful therapist. And at the time, my boyfriend kept saying to me, "Oh, you're crying in your sleep." And I was like, "Well, I wake up and I don't remember it. So I it's fine." But I was becoming, positivity at the time was very difficult to find because I was spending all of my free time around work reading this really dreadful material. And I don't think there's a way, or I don't know of a way to sit with that material for such a long time and feel okay about the world. I started to feel very helpless. And then I remember my therapist saying to me, for somebody who's able to look at most issues with quite a lot of nuance, you're looking at this idea of vicarious trauma in a really black and white way. Because I kept saying, I'm not care experienced. I haven't experienced this story, so it can't affect me. And she was like, no, but most people are not spending literally every waking spare moment reading about infant death or child sexual abuse or whatever it was that week. And it took me a really long time to learn that. And yeah, I certainly, I'm not a trauma survivor in the sense that this character is, but I think it was a long learning process of understanding that, yeah, it's not nothing either. And balance is a big part of that. I don't know what I could have done differently, to be perfectly honest, but it's not good to sit with difficult material for, as much time as I did. Setting, look, I don't know where Burlington came from specifically. The character lives in a lot of places in the States. So she lives in Michigan, she lives in Washington State, in sort of the suburbs of Seattle. I've never been to Michigan. My parents used to live in Minnesota, which is culturally similar, not the same. I've been to the airport in Burlington. I've spent some time in rural Vermont, but not, in the city. It was more a structural thing, this idea that this character needs to make a clean start. She's lived in the Midwest. She's lived in the West Coast. So, it could have probably just as easily been Tucson, Arizona, or I don't know, somewhere in Georgia. But it was just, she literally needed a big, to put a lot of miles between where she'd been last. Thank you. Yeah, it could have been Auroville.
That's it? Okay, that's one last question then, yeah? She's got your book.
Hello, Jennifer. Am I audible?
I can hear you, but maybe try again.
It's not.
Yeah.
It is working. Hello, I read the book and I really liked it. So, the body of light covers themes like self growth and self discovery, right? So, can you share some of the events or experiences that build themes in the book as well?
Thank you. I think, as I think I said right at the beginning of this session, that this I wanted this story to feel like an account that Maggie was providing herself as well as the reader. And in the sense that she's kind of looking back on her life from, with some distance most of the time. I think often it's when we have that little bit of perspective, whether it's temporal or geographical or whatever, it's that thing of kind of being put into a new place, whether that's a literal different setting or a new mindset or whatever else. Whether it's kind of the gift of a few years hindsight, that those are the moments, at least for me, usually where you can look back and identify those moments of growth or change. I think, I don't know, at least for me, maybe I'm dense, but it's very rare that I can sort of identify. I never think, oh, I'm growing, even if something's difficult, I'm not going, yeah, well, this experience, I'll come out of this better. I'm just surviving it or getting through it. And then it's at some point later, I go, okay, I can deal with this because I've done X, Y, Z before or whatever it is. Does that answer your question? Sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Shreya.
you. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Shreya. Yeah.